Hey guys, and welcome to episode 250 of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now in this episode I interviewed licensed professional counsellor Justin Hughes, and Justin is based in Dallas, Texas, and I got him on the show specifically to talk about faith, spirituality and religion within OCD therapy. And this isn't a topic I've covered in any detail before, and I wanted to cover it for those of my listeners that would want this type of content. And Justin and I have this conversation around faith, spirituality and religion in a very open way. And although he is a Christian, he tries to answer the questions, and I try to ask the questions in a way that would be received well by any faith or religion. So hopefully, whatever your beliefs, you can relate to this. And if you don't have any religious or spiritual beliefs, that is fine too. I still think you'll get something out of this episode. So in it, I asked Justin about his therapy story, how faith or spirituality and therapy can work together, when OCD shakes someone's faith, Christian scriptures around fear, worry and uncertainty, working with shame from the taboo nature of intrusive thoughts, living with uncertainty, words of hope, and much, much more. We cover so much depth in this episode. I really enjoyed chatting to Justin. And a quick shout out for our podcast partners, NoCD. NoCD Therapy matches you with a licensed therapist trained to treat OCD, offers a personalized treatment plan delivered through face-to-face video sessions. Between therapy sessions, you can use their therapeutic tools in the app 24/7, message your therapist, and learn what helps other people in their OCD peer community. To find out more, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the stories or click the link in the episode description. Thanks to Justin for his time, and as always, to you guys for listening. I hope this episode helps. On the podcast today is Justin Hughes. Justin is a licensed professional counselor in Dallas, Texas, who specializes in CBT for obsessive compulsive disorder. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thank you, Stuart.
It's good to have you here. And as you know, I love to hear therapists, whether it's someone with OCD, their story, or a therapist's therapy story. So, what got you into being a therapist, and then why OCD?
I love this story. And first of all, just what an honor to be on here. I come with so much humility because I myself don't have OCD, which is part of what makes me so passionate for it, in a sense. I'll discuss that here in a moment. I fell in love with the people. So I started in a clinic, a large clinic, where I did my practicum and my internship. And I started to see folks that came into the day hospital and intensive program who had OCD. And at the time, I didn't understand it a lot. So most master's programs, at least with colleagues that I've spoken with, it's a master's level program. We're really trying to cover the generals, the basics. So I wasn't armed with a ton of information, except people. I started to interact and engage with people. And I found and I don't completely understand all the reasons still to this day why. Maybe I understand some of them, but I started to be drawn to those who suffered with OCD and just had a huge heart. And when that happened, then clinically, I began to look at resources and tools. So the very first thing that I purchased was the OCD workbook. I think it's by Hyman and Pedrick. And it's a decent workbook. It doesn't go super heavy in depth to ERP, but it got me started in describing a conceptual framework to clients. And maybe selfishly, I probably felt like a rock star because clients would eat that up. They'd say, wait, hold on. These thoughts don't sound crazy to you? It's like, no. So wait, these thoughts, then if I give them credits, they actually get worse? Yeah, so here's the OCD cycle. And so from there, I found that it helped initially with some good psychoeducation, but the clients that I worked with were just some of the sweetest people in the world. And so as I began to progress in my career, I, first of all, specialized in addiction and worked a lot with addiction. But then I was seeing more and more cases over time with OCD. And I'll say, unfortunately, not equipped with a ton of tools. So I began to understand exposure and response prevention as the gold standard. But the practice of it too is also different than just a textbook understanding.
Yeah.
So I began to pursue that more and more. Every single step of the way, I'd pursue it. And then a watershed moment came, and this, I promised the listeners I wasn't paid to say this, but the watershed moment was ultimately when I reached out to a colleague that could case consult with me, and then had pointed me to the IOCDF, and had pointed me to the BTTI training. And I did my first one in Boston, and things changed. I came back, I talked to my wife. It was this watershed moment. I think this is what I want to do full time. For somebody who had already been practicing for 6 years or so, not only did I fall in love with the people, but then I had even more skill in training.
Yeah.
To be fair, I mean, just starting out still in the specialty realm, to then merge the two, and then it just exploded in a good way from there.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And I love hearing people's stories. So yeah, I guess today, so we're going to unpack, actually, well, let's continue on from that. So today we're going to talk about faith, spirituality, religion, those three words. And I guess before we get into that, how did that come into your journey, your therapy training?
Yeah, so for me, it's pretty easy to explain. I went to a seminary for training, which a lot of times if I say that I went to a seminary, the first question is, so you're a priest? Or what is that exactly? Like, how many days of silence did you pledge yourself to? And so, the seminary was Dallas Theological Seminary. And for me as a Christian, I wanted to really go deep in theology, but also counseling. And the great thing about DTS is that it had a degree program that was excellent on the clinical side, set folks up for state licensure, which is my first and foremost passion from a career standpoint, is to be a clinician, but then to equivalently get basically a whole master's in counseling, or excuse me, master's in theology-ish. It's just one degree. So from a faith standpoint, it just really, really clicked for me to be able to do that. And I don't know, maybe I just like a beating when it comes to academics and things like that. And I got a little bit of it because it was a lot, but it was good. So that's a very brief description of how I got into it.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I think it's a different angle than some of the other clinicians and therapists I've had on, who maybe haven't had that theological training alongside the clinical. So I think it's going to make an interesting take on today's podcast.
I know. I'm curious where we go.
Yeah. So it's such, I was thinking when I was writing my questions for this episode, I realized it's such a huge topic, and I'm never going to be able to write the questions to do the topic justice. So I guess I'll start off by apologizing to anyone. I'm bound to miss some of the questions you probably want me to ask. But yeah, I guess I'll start off very vague and then we'll narrow down. Is how do you kind of merge the two, or how do you bring kind of faith and OCD together? How does it kind of meet in the room?
Whew, yeah, big question, good question. So first and foremost, all of the work that I do starts with strong assessment. I was taught that assessment is treatment, and building upon good assessment helps us to be more successful along the way. And if we look at the whole person, most are familiar in the counseling world with the biopsychosocial model of saying, okay, our biology, psychology, and social, they all have an influence on each other. So let's look at those things. And I'm going to throw in a fourth, and not just me, but a lot of folks do, the spiritual piece. If we look at the evidence-based research that exists, if we do a literature review, we'll discover that faith and spirituality is important to most people. Obviously, a lot of different definitions and so on and so forth. And so I think it's so important to, and this is where counseling training helps a lot, to come to the table respectfully, to be able to tolerate distress or differences, to not necessarily get tripped up on one thing or one perspective, but first and foremost, it involves asking a question, which is, do you have any faith or spiritual beliefs that matter to you? Or not? Because, for example, for my clients who are atheists and agnostic, if they come in and on their questionnaire, when I ask about their religious or spiritual upbringing or background and currents, that's huge. Because take Dallas, for example. Dallas is a culture versus some other world cities that is much more overt about faith and spirituality. And so sometimes folks can come in feeling really isolated, like, oh gosh, everybody kind of believes in God, or everybody seems like they're Christian here, or whatever else. And so starting with a question is, I think, where it all begins.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and it just got me thinking. I was just thinking how many therapists would necessarily ask that question. And I'm not saying I think it's a good thing, because I think it tells a lot. Because as you said, even if they put agnostic or atheist, there's potentially a discussion to be had there. Not to convert anyone, but just it will bring up if they've been in a very Christian-dominated or Hindu-dominated culture and they don't identify with that, they may have had a lot of conflict growing up, which you could work with that in the room as well and heal that part of them. Okay, so how often? Because I guess people also identify you, that they may find you on your website and see, okay, he's a Christian, or he's going to be accepting of other faiths as well, and work with my faith and my spirituality, whatever that is. So I'm assuming they bring that up anyway, even if you wouldn't have done the questionnaire. And how often do you see OCD kind of really shake people's faith? Like, they're suffering anyway because of OCD. But then how often do they, I don't want to say lose faith, but it kind of starts to get shaken because of OCD?
Well, automatically, and I don't have specific numbers to back this up, but I would say super common, super common. And just backing up, and if we look at what OCD is and what results, it results in a level of distress. I'll let what it is be covered by other broadcasts and so forth, and save some time, just kind of jump in. But the impact is so incredibly severe. We know that it's one of the most disabling disorders on the face of this planet, including medical disorders as well. And that I believe, the last I saw, that 1 out of 3 with OCD will experience disability at some point in their lives. And so the implications are vast. So that's going to look like impacting work, impacting relationships, impacting a sense of self, impacting goals, sleep, and then of course spirituality and faith as well. So one of the debilitating impacts of OCD in the faith realm is seeing a person coming in and they're finding themselves not engaging in those values and beliefs that they have, and maybe have lived out at one time very, very well. And part of that tension and that incongruence that they feel, and I think this is true in general with other topics or other issues that'll come up, can be so isolating. And a lot of times, I think the faith community can do an amazing job. And then also one of the ways that it does a really sucky job, honestly, is just well, why don't you just fall into line? Just do this. Come on, stop it. Why are you doing this? Differently, and especially because the insight is, in my experience, typically pretty good. We talk about ego dystonic in OCD, and having obsessions and thoughts that are unwanted and unwished for. And so when this type of person will open up, maybe to clergy, to a pastor, priest, imam, etc., the responses can be very supportive, but at the same time, it can be that pressure of, oh, well, just believe what you say. You believe. So I think there's a lot to be said, but I think maybe one of the biggest things is that piece of maybe identity feels like it gets stripped from a person, which is a pretty severe thing.
Absolutely. And I think that's why I asked it, because for people who have a faith and it's deeply important to them, to have that shaken is a kind of, it's a real part, as you said, their identity that's not strong in that moment, when in fact that's probably when they need it the most to kind of help work through the OCD, and I guess the other thing that came up for me there when you were saying is, I guess when some people bring it up in their community, be that the church, the mosque, wherever, and sometimes I'm sure, hopefully most of the time, it's very accepting and very tolerant, and people kind of supporting through that. But I can imagine there's occasions where, whether it's the religious figure or just someone within the religious community, is not as supportive, or says something like, just pray harder, or that type of stuff.
Yeah.
How does that come up a lot, or is that quite rare from what you've seen?
Good question. I don't think it's rare. I think that the person with OCD is typically the hardest person on themselves. In my experience with it, it's seems to be a minority of cases where a person would come in ranging from a level of abuse, spiritual abuse, to just pressure. And some of that may be normative to some extent, that if it's a different issue or topic, that a person with OCD may have run into tensions with a coworker over something at any given points or in their community. Sure, that's going to happen, of course, with faith stuff, but I don't think it's rare that there's problems, but it's not necessarily all the time.
No, thank you. And I guess the next question is, I don't know how common this is. It may be very rare, but I'll ask it in case there's one person listening who could benefit from it.
I love that.
Let's say there's one person who they're listening to this podcast because they want to try and figure this OCD thing out, but maybe there's some kind of internal stigma within themselves, or maybe from their community, that says this isn't a mental health issue, this is a religious issue or a spiritual issue. This should be dealt with in the I'll say church, but roll that out to every kind of building, religious building. So I guess, what would you say to them that kind of this I don't need to come and see you, Justin, I just need to deal with this within my community?
Yeah, no, that's a fabulous question. My guess is that there's more than one person who would listen to this, and but the humility of that question too, Stuart, is something that I've appreciated in hearing some of your others. To think of the one, that's where we start. It's like I won't take us on a side rail of all sorts of other things, but it's easy to want to change everything. Like, okay, there's this problem in the world, we got to change it all. It starts with one. It starts with me. And so I love that. So even if it is just one person, a client who comes in obviously differ on a number of factors, but let's just say, generally speaking, hey, I think this is a spiritual issue. A lot of folks don't fight me too hard on it. I'm probably, I get a certain bias of clients who come in because by the time they're actually in my office, they've already gone through those questions. The average person, to put this in a negative sense, I don't want to spend that much money if they're just going to disagree with the counselor. There's a treatment readiness typically that's already there. But sometimes that comes up, or in minor ways. I would say that, since at least with adult clients, there's teens are a different story. But adult clients, if there's that treatment readiness, they've already been through the gauntlet, so to speak, of okay, these people have said this or this, but I think I need to just try this or whatever. Many times it's a family member. And I'm thinking of one case in specific that I can't know, because if somebody disappears without saying, but thinking of somebody who just fell off the map, and last I knew was related to I think, a family member speaking about, I don't think you need to address it from the therapeutic standpoint. That's just my guess. So it comes up in a number of ways. And I don't have a great answer. I see some of it is kind of the culmination of a number of things. Treatment readiness, we'll talk about that clinically. And let me just say clinically, we have to practice humility because we don't know all those factors. When ERP is extraordinarily successful when it's successful, but there's a lot of people, I think about 20%, that just turn it down flat off. They're like, hey, you want to do some ERP? They're like, nope. That sounds scary. That sounds stupid, that whatever it is. And then go a little bit further, and about 20%-ish of people, maybe slightly more, will drop out after starting. But the people who stick around with ERP are getting 60 to 70% symptom reduction. And so when we study these things treatment-wise, we're like, effectively then about 40% or so of people aren't getting this when they make it to the treatment. And that's if they go to a specialist. Yeah. And so treatment readiness is huge, but what facilitates it, we're still trying to figure that out. So when we think of almost like a spiritual readiness, if we could say that, or like a, not from like a higher platform, almost like a cognitive readiness, I'm going to try to expose a person really quickly up front with some great education. And for example, just most commonly working in the Christian realm, try to really look at what Scripture says about fear and the role of fear. Like a common, maybe you've actually seen a meme. I actually find these kind of funny. The memes that say, not today, Satan. Those have just been catching my attention. I think they're kind of funny. But a lot of times there's this attribution that can be a misattribution, like, oh my goodness, my car broke down today. That's my Dallas accent. Yeah. My car broke down today and it must have been Satan. Well, theologically, as a Christian, we're going to look at the Bible and say, okay, we believe in evil forces, in good forces, in Satan, yes. And at the same time, like, what leads you to make that attribution? So I'm going to educate, and then also hopefully jump in and figure out where are some of the incongruencies, because when we actually look at the faith principles, at some point, anybody, at least part of any main congregation, is going to be able to say, okay, yeah, I don't believe that every little leaf that rattles on a tree has meaning. Every little step that I make necessarily needs to be a bigger thing. Sometimes it's just a step. Sometimes it's just a leaf, et cetera, et cetera. And so the education piece is really big there. Asking questions is really big. And then at the end of the day, I think there's just a mystery to that readiness, that some are ready and some are not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. I agree with that. And everything came to me, sometimes it's just your pickup truck not working. There's no evil force behind it necessarily.
Yeah,
the carburetor's just blown. Yeah. No, I'm blanked again. No, thank you. That was useful, really useful. And I liked what you said there about bringing Scripture into the room and being like, oh, where does fear come in? And there's the book of Matthew in the Bible, and there's a verse in there which talks about do not worry about tomorrow, for today has enough worries of its own. Right. And I love that, because that when I think about anxiety, at least from Scripture, and I guess full disclosure, I'm England is technically a Christian country, but I wouldn't say it's as Christian as America. You guys do it much harder than we do still. Which that isn't a criticism, it's just an observation. But
that's a hilarious observation.
But I was still raised, with being taught Scripture and stuff in my schools and all of that. So I know a lot of it, and two of my closest friends are to this day very Christian. And yeah, that verse has always stuck with me. When I think about anxiety, if I think about that verse, it kind of gives me comfort of I'm worrying about tomorrow. I'm not focused on today, What other kind of verses come to mind around fear or worry or anxiety in the Bible?
Ooh, yes, love this. things that you're tapping my thoughts on writings in progress and some that I've already done. Yeah, so that's a big one. I have a Bible with etched on it telephone wires with birds on it, which basically, if God so cares for the birds, won't he care that much more for you? You have little faith, which is a gracious statement. It's not like, oh, you have little faith. It's, oh, come on. It's like the little child being spurred on. Also, probably one of the big ones, and this is where my story intersects a bit with understanding OCD, and one of the reasons why I think that I get it a little bit more. I actually have generalized anxiety disorder and persistent depressive disorder, formerly known as, the artist formerly known as dysthymic disorder. Shout out to Minnesota there and Prince. Yeah. My generalized anxiety has taken the form a lot of times of scrupulous thoughts and worries about, did I do things well enough? Was I honest enough? One popped up this weekend that I was stuck on for a couple of hours / trying to insert the skills and tools that I teach others to do. But that stuff still comes up. And so a big part of my journey was everything from the therapeutic side of things to the spiritual side of things, et cetera. So that's where that can really connect, and I can get it when a client comes in OCD, they're saying, I feel like I didn't pray this right, or it doesn't feel right until I pray it a certain way. I've had moments of that. I've had minutes and hours and days of that, but fortunately it hasn't gone to the level of days and years, as it oftentimes does with OCD. And again, it's different. It's egosyntonic typically with generalized anxiety. We won't get into all those things, but so perfect love casts out fear. First John, I believe. When we look at the instances, the most common directive in Scripture is actually some version of do not be afraid, do not fear, fear not. The most common. One would think that, oh yeah, by the way, don't screw over your neighbor by stealing from them, would happen more. Or, by the way, don't put other people down, don't sleep with somebody else's spouse, or fill in the blank, like whatever a person thinks would occur most of all. Honor the Sabbath, eat certain foods, don't eat certain foods, whatever it is. Actually, it's do not fear, be not afraid. And that's kind of a big deal. And so I'm still a little bit early on this, so I'll please let me come on and replace this if it changed it. No, but I'm starting to develop a little bit of an understanding from Scripture related to fear versus temptation, because a lot of times Christians will come in and it's like, okay, wait a second, you want me to expose myself to this, or you want me to do an exposure script to this statement. Like, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm not a Christian. Maybe God doesn't love me. You know what? Maybe I'm a terrible person. Maybe I'll kill my family someday, or whatever the script is. And one of the initial hesitations that a lot of folks have is that's speaking negatively. That's not dwelling on what's true and good and lovely, and so on and so forth. And what I do is I look at it and say, hold on. Do we have a reason sometimes to look at negative things? Back to the psychoeducation, if we really understand how OCD works and what we have to do to combat it, well, do we really believe that we have to be sugary positive all the time? No. Like, it's going to involve looking at bad things. Mourn with those who mourn is one scripture. And so if that's the case, we're going to sit in some serious, I'm not going to swear because it's a live recording, but serious doo-doo with other people in life. And so do we have a reason, if we have a thought and these repetitive thoughts that we need to sit with, to go ahead and sit with that? So it's a little bit of a shift in the focus, that when we look at the do not be afraid, and it's not the fleeing temptation, because we're told to flee temptation, run from it. Well, in OCD, people will say, I have this concern that generally, of course, there can be, past history of fill in the blank, an item occurring or something happening. But the whole point of OCD is the intrusive, unwanted. And so can we sit with this? Can we sit with this fear? Can we face it? Because I think that that's what we're told to do. We're not supposed to flee that, because at that moment, that singular moment, that's not the temptation. It's this fear that we have to face. And so coming back around, that was the longest winded answer, I think. But yes, perfect love casts out fear. Do not be afraid.
Yeah. No, I like that. And what came to me is I was listening to another podcast a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, and they were talking about, it was actually, well, they weren't Hindus, but they were heavily influenced by that. They were big into the meditation culture, Buddhism, Hinduism, and they were talking about Jesus and looking at, sorry, one of them was a Christian, but they were talking about Jesus, and it was, I think she said it was love, or perfect love, that got him on the cross, if that makes sense, or kept him on the cross, I should say. Because if he didn't have that, the fear, he never would have kind of, obviously he was kind of forced on there. I'm not saying it was kind of love that pushed him on there, but it was that sacrifice for the people that kind of kept him there. Yeah. So I think he was obviously afraid, but I would assume not as much because of why he was doing it. It was love, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Which is a great reason to step into suffering. Mourn with those who mourn. So when we see others suffer, how do we love them? A lot of times we step into suffering. And I think that that's just one of the most beautiful things that therapy can offer, is that it's the clinical intentionality of stepping into suffering with people. But then when we actually look at what's successful, I would say, and maybe this is arrogant to say, but at least I conceptually think that almost at every level, we have to step into suffering to heal from it, whatever the disorder is. And it's especially true with OCD. And do we do that in love? And do we do that in a way that we're connected with the deeper, bigger picture?
Yeah, I agree. I think whatever brings someone to the therapy room, there's solution-focused therapy where you're kind of avoiding the painful thing and focusing on the solution. But almost every other type of therapy, you're going to those darker places and you're working with them to try and cleanse them.
And one thing I'll just say too with that is that, back to the assessment piece and doing a functional assessment, how does something function? How does a behavior function, or a thoughts or a feeling, etc.? It tells us so much information about what to do. And so, there's a lot of talk through the OCD Stories podcast on how much talk therapy is not the first line treatment, is not a first line treatment at all for OCD. And that's exactly right. It is first line treatment for some disorders. And when we truly step back in humility, do an assessment, functional assessment of how does this work, we get the opportunity to look it more clearly in the face. So leaning into that suffering sometimes is not exploring the quote unquote meaning, or what the heck does this mean, the content. Sometimes it means taking just a little bit more time with the content. Sometimes it means sitting completely in content, but it depends on the disorder and what we're tackling. And so I love the reference of sitting in suffering in love, because that's going to really differ from person to person, to thing to thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the content there, and very much I've said it, many of my guests have said it, around kind of not working with the content, because the content, as Reed says, is trash.
Yes.
Did say the first time on my podcast.
Love Reed.
Which, rightly annoys some people, but he's not dismissing their feelings. He's just saying you don't need to focus on the content, focus on the mechanics of OCD, and that's where the work is done. But there's the disclaimer over. I guess from a faith point of view, whatever the person's religion or faith is, most religions kind of agree on the idea of not doing harm to anyone and being a good person. And if you really boil it and generalize it down. So if you're then, or if I'm then, say, having thoughts around harming someone I love, or even a stranger, or abusing someone, or about God, him or herself, I guess, do you take time to work with that? Because although that's the content, it is now very much attacking their religious beliefs, which are core values to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. So, all for the sake of brevity, I can talk a bit, as you discovered already. Feel free to edit as you desire. So, with that, learning to become a specialist for OCD absolutely requires learning at definitely learning the gold standard treatment, ERP, and certainly doing a first-line treatment. So technically speaking, by the way, cognitive therapy for OCD is a first-line treatment. We call OCD or ERP the gold standard when it comes down to it, as it's the best starting place, unless if you have a darn good reason not to. Now, what are some of the reasons why we might actually talk a little bit more about the content, the cognitions, and where does cognitive therapy for OCD shine? Well, in the research, we discover that it's especially sexual and religious obsessions. Personally, just anecdotally, I typically link in the R OCD obsessions, relational, because I think it's getting into that very similar category that some will call, of course, the pure O, etc. So the thing is that, to the point that a person really, really just doesn't know how to sort out their head from their foot with an obsession, we have to talk a little bit. We have to identify, like, what are your beliefs there? And the whole point of cognitive therapy in that realm is really to say, hey, you've got a lot of beliefs and thoughts that are driving this. And most people with OCD will be like, well, yeah, duh. But cognitive therapy specifically is going to get into the mechanism, the specifics of how do we dismantle these beliefs and cognitive distortions. And if they're a bit egocentric, if I'm holding on to them a bit too tightly, we're going to have to go there, which doesn't mean giving credit to the content in the normative sense of how we might think of it, but it means that we're going to have to dismantle some of those beliefs that a person's still holding as true that might not be, cognitive distortions and thinking errors and so on and so forth. And so as I say this, I don't want anybody to think that I'm touting at all non-ERP. Not at all. I am solid ERP. It's where we need to be spending most of our time. But in that realm of these, I guess we'd call it overvalued ideation, no, I do think that I need to be praying for 12 hours a day. Okay, like, we got to talk about that, because if that automatically is going to start to lead to problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess on that example, because the 12 hours a day, to me, I don't know any religion that kind of says 12 hours a day. So to me, that clearly comes across as a red flag, OCD alert type thing. But I guess for someone like that who in that case, their religion has now linked with OCD, and you've got to try and get them to reduce those compulsions so they can start to feel better from OCD. But do it in a way that they feel they're not letting their God down. I guess, how do you kind of balance that, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And so that's where I think just the classic behavioral hierarchy is really helpful. And gosh, I don't know if it's an issue of just messing it up, but there's definitely the times where I've just come in too hot on the hierarchy, and I'm like, dang it. And most of the time, folks who stick with it will just have a conversation. No big deal. That's the point. I tell them up front, hey, be assertive. Let me know if it's too much, too little. Please talk to me. But sometimes I'll lose somebody. And I can only guess, but feel pretty confident a number of times that I just came in too hot on the hierarchy. And for them, it just felt too much like a grave violation of their faith or belief or whatever else. So that's what I typically look at is hierarchically. And back to the assessment again, if I'm really asking those good questions, like where are you? What are you willing to do? Could you take for the person who's at a very severe level, if they feel like they need to constantly pray and they're mouthing prayers or things like that, even during the session, seen it. Well, okay. Do you think it's okay if you took a second? Like literally a second. I'm not trying to use hyperbolic language and be like a second and really mean 5 minutes. No, like literally a second. Could you do that? Working from that standpoint, I think is pretty essential. As long as the person has a basis of understanding of what they're trying to do, and then maybe I have to go back a bit to talk with them a little bit more, and or try to get that loved one, family member, or clergy on board. Like, hey, let's get a conversation with them to see what are they going to say that you need to be doing, and everybody else in your congregation. Let's figure that out.
Yeah. No, I like that. And it was actually one of my questions around how often or when would you bring the kind of, I'll say religious leader, and that sounds a bit cult-like, and I don't mean that, but the priest, the imam, whoever, the monk, when would you bring them in to kind of support alongside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So probably an ideal would be every case. That doesn't happen in the real world. As far as the outside consultation piece, my ideal being most of the time, I'd say it's probably in actuality for me gets to be about 20% of cases or 30%, but only the person with absolutely amazing insight, total treatment readiness comes to therapy, and we're just knocking stuff out. At least individually, they don't need to have necessarily a conversation themselves privately with someone. But yeah, ideally, as much as possible, getting an outside person, even if it's not that clergy member. Sometimes it's a spouse or a family member who holds to a similar perspective that they respect.
Yeah, and I mean, the 20% actually surprised me. I thought you would have said less than that, so I think that's great. Because I can imagine it's very healing and supportive when the priest or pastor that they look up to, no doubt, comes in and is willing to work alongside, and it kind of it takes the psychological therapy and reintegrates it back within the community, back into their faith, which is surely like a healing thing.
Oh man, yeah, well said. Well said. In community, I love that word. Very important. So doing this in community. So even if a person comes in and says, spirituality, that's not that important to me, faith, all right, that's fine. The only time I'm going to prompt them when they might not want to talk about it is if they tell me direct, like, oh, hey, there's this avoidance that I have. And then maybe it's a part of the clinical conversation to be like, well, you say this, and can I ask you a question about it? But I'm always going to respect where a person wants to go, what they're willing to talk about, et cetera, or not. And so that community. I don't know if there's research on this in the OCD realm. There's definitely research outside of OCD related to integration with community and mental health outcomes. And we're not talking about, oh, let's just slap you in some weird, strange group that you don't feel a part of because you're supposed to be there. No, like when we really connect deeply with our community, this just anecdotally is one of the biggest things that I see as super successful. So I've baked it into my first conversations with clients. Like if you have a trusting relationship or trusting enough with fill in the blank. So, if it's, the younger person, this family member, if it's the person in relationship, their partner, spouse, etc., and so on and so forth. Let's involve them. OCD is isolating enough. Let's get you engaged in the things that really matter. And that's a big part of how I think we win this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And then let me just make sure I've asked my questions. I guess my next question is, so I think when we were initially discussing the topic for this podcast, you mentioned about, people will come to you who aren't Christians but have a different religion because they know that you'll respect their religion. I guess, yeah, just for people who are worried about going to see a therapist who may not know what religion the therapist is, if any religion, because they haven't put it on their website. But I guess I can imagine for some people they're worried about going somewhere and being judged, or the person not understanding their religion, or I guess it's a similar question. We could replace this with culture and ethnic backgrounds and all of this, and even gender. But yeah, I guess from a religious point of view, I guess just to appease some worries for people around this.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, I think it's so basic to us as humans that we want to be understood, we want to be known, we want to be loved across the board, be able to have a place free of judgment. And so that seems super across the board. Even, this is a name that may not have come up in your podcast, but the famed Dr. Irvin, I believe it's Yalom. Maybe some say Yalom.
I say Yalom, but yeah.
Yalom. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, he's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And he practices from an existential standpoint, and believes that that just connection with others is so basic and so important. And so as we talk about some of these important things that are integrated, even in exposure and response prevention, even if we go very behavioral, we've got our hierarchy. We're not doing any of the cognitive therapy to speak of, etc. Well, there's these factors that seem to really facilitate growth in people's lives. We don't always know what that's going to be for everyone, but community is huge. Having a safe place to be, to talk is huge. And that's so powerful. I've had that in my own life and in my own therapy. And I've had it with family members and friends and my wife and so on and so forth. And it's in that context that I believe we grow so much. And so on the therapy side, I think it's important that those seeking out therapy know that they can ask those questions. It's not offensive. I don't think that's offensive at all. One of my favorites little articles that the International OCD Foundation has written is choosing a therapist. And they've got some tough questions on there. How many cases have you treated of OCD and so on and so forth. But they're great things to ask. And so even just turning that around, sometimes it's a little bit more obvious. A person maybe like myself has a certain niche, or says, hey, I went to seminary, hey, Christ-centered counseling if you desire, but I'm not going to press that on you. But it's important early on to have some of those conversations and to determine a fit. The reality is fit is a thing. And so sometimes you'll bring up those questions and it's like, I really didn't like this dude's answer. And that's okay too. But of course, the flip side is we have to be careful of making excuses as well and finding the perfect therapist, which I can say can happen a lot on the spiritual side, looking for the perfect quote unquote Christian therapist or whatever. But back to the point. Yeah. Safe, free of condemnation. Important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, definitely in my trainings, cultural competence is a phrase that's been hammered into me and rightly so. But about most therapists are trained to a good standard, that they may not completely understand your religion, your culture, whatever it is. like I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I've never been one, not in this lifetime anyway. But um, uh, but I've done my best to try and understand to the best I can. And I'm never going to truly know, but I have some kind of competence to work with women and understand to a point. And it's the same, there's various religions I am not, or faiths. But if I don't know and I'm ignorant to them, I will go away and I'll learn the best I can, or I will ask the person if it's appropriate. And that's, I think, cultural competence is most therapists. I guess I'm saying this just to reassure people. Most therapists are trained to work with whoever and adjust and adapt.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. And if it doesn't seem like they are, kick them to the curb.
Yeah, exactly. It's a red flag. Okay, cool. No, thank you for that. So, general question now. Advice for living with uncertainty.
Thoughts are thoughts. Feelings are feelings. Use them as pointers to tune you into your experience. And surround yourself with good community to focus on what matters.
Yeah, I like that. And is there any Bible verses that link to uncertainty?
Yeah. So I'm doing a little piece on this, writing on it. I think that the word mystery is maybe the best. If we're doing a word search, we won't actually find uncertainty a lot, reference, at least in the English translation. So mystery is a very, very common term in scriptures. And we have these instances where a mystery is revealed, but then there's still this mystery. This piece, it says in the New Testament that we will be known even as we are fully known. There's this piece that we don't know yet. We don't know fully. We see in a mirror dimly, which is, it's a reference to like first, second century mirrors, which basically is, a piece of rock that's, it's not the same as mirrors that we have today. So you see this rough reflection, kind of like trying to, comb your hair, looking down in a pond, like you'll get some, but not fully. There's always mystery. There's always uncertainty. And it's such a beautiful thing to actually be able to accept that, because well, it's just reality, and that's part of it.
Absolutely. And the word mystery to me seems, at least how I interpret it, because I'm sure others will interpret it differently, but it's quite not necessarily a good thing, but it's a mystery. It's exciting. It's, what will be, we don't know. That's why it's a mystery. And I guess similar with uncertainty, it's obviously, it feels very uncomfortable in terms of OCD. But if I liken it to the word mystery, it's not entirely bad. It's we don't know. That's the truth. We don't know if it's good or bad, and that could either be exciting or scary based on our perspective.
Yes. And I see that word curiosity as well, that can link to that, because uncertainty is automatically what this is, for a lot of people at least. But mystery, just the language around that can be like, okay, maybe I'm going to watch and see. Maybe I'm going to notice. And it's really interesting. If we look at the Gospels and birth of Jesus, and then birth of John the Baptist, you have Zechariah, who basically, he's like, this is absolutely ridiculous. That's my wife Elizabeth is going to be pregnant. He didn't have faith, and so the story is pretty fascinating to read. But actually, Mary had this faith that said that she stored these things up in her heart. She's watching this stuff as it goes down, and that's clearly not absent of fear. She had some major suffering, major suffering, but stored these things up. So that mystery, where we can look at that. And what a time in the world right now, where being able to see mystery and uncertainty and to be able to say, all right, maybe I don't know this or where this is going. Is that okay? Can that be okay?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 2020 has been a year of uncertainty for almost 7.8 billion people on the planet.
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
yes, it's a real key time for that word, not just for the listeners of the show. I guess words of hope. Anything you want to share about OCD treatment?
Mm. There is hope.
Mm.
There is hope. When I sit under the experts who teach in this realm, I consider that the people that have been going at this for decades on end, doing the research and teaching, they keep on telling me there's hope. And I've heard it from enough people of disparate personalities to realize that I'm not just being tricked or sold a bill of goods. And I've done it long enough myself and specialized in it long enough to see we just got to keep at it, because there is hope. It's treatable. And also, even though this can seem very interesting in the realm of ERP, or maybe weird, you might not hear this from your ERP therapist, but you're loved. There's hope and you're loved. Wow. For me, those I'll hang on to any level of mystery with those two things in my viewpoint.
I like that, and I appreciate that. And I think love isn't a term you'll hear often in the therapy room, and but I'm sure most therapists have some semblance of love in their hearts for the person they're treating. That came up in one of my trainings. One of my lecturers said it is love. It's, you wouldn't do this work if there was no love. And she even said, you won't hear other lecturers talk about this, but it's there.
I like that.
And I guess there's stigma around that. But I guess what else came up for me is I always ask the question around hope, right? Hope is a word that I'm perfectly comfortable saying, and perfectly comfortable. I think if you could bottle it up, someone would and make billions of profit on it. It's a powerful drug. But I know in Hebrews 11:1, the kind of it doesn't, mocks the wrong word, but it puts hope down in replace of faith. And I guess I wonder if you know that off by heart. I kind of butcher it every time I try it. If you could just share that.
Yeah. So faith is the substance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mix up the wording most times too.
In evidence of something. Hope. Yeah. But it basically says you need faith over hope, right? Faith is kind of, it's done, or it's going to get done. Whereas hope is like, I hope it gets done. That's how I kind of interpret it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't know if that's a correct interpretation, but I guess, maybe I should change that question. But I guess because we're talking about faith today, is, having, whether you're religious or not, having faith that this treatment is going to work versus hope that it's going to work.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I went ahead and pulled it up. I cheated, in the era of Google. And anyway, so now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So that aspect, that there's going to be faith in any number of things, and is what we have faith in, strong enough, is it my 401k, at this point, or my stocks, or fill in the blank, or my daughter acting the way that I would like her to, or whatever else. So that object of faith, of course, hopefully it's going to be pretty strong and powerful. And when we look at something like the treatments for OCD, there is this piece of faith, which I want to give credit to all the people who to lean into it every day, whether with the therapist at this point or outside of therapy, because there is that piece that when the doubt comes, when that hits, when that uncertainty hits, the person still has to respond out of faith with that, if you will, to speak a bit more generally. And that's such a hard thing to do and such a tricky thing to learn when we're hit and when our world is rocked, to stay faithful to these things. And so back to a little bit of what we've discussed, like surrounding ourselves with really good community who can keep cheering us on, asking really good questions, et cetera, et cetera. I like your differentiation on that, it's not just like, all right, it's like Bon Jovi, oh, living on a prayer, where it's just like throwing this out like, okay, well, I don't got anything left, so let's hope this works. Yeah. No, it's like, okay, you know what? I have a darn good reason to look at this, and I guess we'll see. What if? Okay, I guess I gotta face it down and see. Got to take this to the end.
Yeah, no, thank you for explaining that. Another one of that is Jim Carrey in his speech he did at MMU, and he talks about, he says something like, hope is a beggar. He said, hope steps over the fire while faith leaps over it. And I really like that. I mean, I'm probably still going to keep the wording on my question of words of hope, but I just thought I would raise this now. Okay, so you could pick up the phone and call your 20-year-old self. What do you tell him?
I think stay faithful to the things that stay humble, keep pressing on those doubts that you have, those uncertainties. 20s were my most difficult time, I think, of life. Just keep steady. Keep steady. Everyone tends to underestimate the impact of years and overestimates days. And that can be true with emotional growth or investing money. I want it now. It's got to change now. And I think just being able to tell myself, just stay stable, and also just accept that some days just are really going to stink. And that's okay. It's okay to not be okay. Yeah. In fact, don't you want that? Because that's where the growth comes. If you try to avoid that, then you're not pushing yourself enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Good phone call. So you've got a billboard in Dallas. What do you want written on that billboard?
Man, billboard in Dallas. I would say back to the uncertainty thing of thoughts are thoughts, feelings are feelings, to learn to live according to what matters. Yeah.
Absolutely. And lastly then, is there anything else that you wish you could have shared today?
I think, in the context of there is hope, one of the things I want to encourage folks is that when we get into conversation of spiritual matters, religious matters, it's necessarily going to poke different people in different ways. I can imagine there's some folks cheering like, oh, thank goodness, finally, because I see that, I hear that, I've seen writings like there's not enough talk about spiritual things at this point in therapy and for a lot of reasons. But then there's some that this is not going to sit well with. And for some, it could be a number of reasons, but some have been so poorly mistreated in communities or their church or whatever else. And so I still want to just kind of take those words that there's hope that a lot of folks have said on your podcast before, that there's hope, and I specifically would like to point it towards those who might wrestle a little bit more with this. It could be for any number of reasons, and to not just for those who would come in, sit in my office, to know that I seek to make it that safe space for them. But those who are just suffering, period, that there's hope. So however this podcast hits you today, there's still hope and you're loved. That's just what I'd like to say.
No, thank you. Well, it took me 100 episodes to talk about medication, and it's taken me nearly 250 episodes to talk about faith. So, both big topics that I probably should have covered sooner. So, but thank you for sharing it and giving your perspective. I appreciate it.
It was an honor. So
there you have it. Thank you so much to Justin for his time. To you guys for your time. I always appreciate it. And don't forget, today's podcast is sponsored by NoCD. To find out more about NoCD and their therapy plans, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. Until we speak, take care.